Hey guys, I'm Naya and welcome back to the channel. For today's video, we're gonna be discussing the best budget decks in today's meta. I picked 6 with the most success in the last couple of events, and we're gonna go through basically what the most expensive cards in those strategies cost, why they are good, what are some of the more expensive additions you can add if you want, but are not necessary for the strategy to perform well, and we're also going to go over some of the deck lists. So, before we get started, I would like to encourage you to subscribe. Also, let me know down in the comments what you think of the decks, if you're playing any of them. Before we move forward, I would like to give an honorable mention to Flunder. As much as the deck is cheap, everything is very cheap, and since the Rise Out the Mega Monarch reprint, even that card is cheap. Pot of Prosperity is expensive. It's very, very, very expensive, but those cards are a necessary addition to the deck, and that's why I think it shouldn't be included as a budget deck. There's that, and now we can go on and get started with the actual 6 best decks. And I'm calling them the best budget decks because, like I said, they have been seeing the most success recently. And we're going to be starting with Salamangreat, and Salamangreat has gotten, with the ban list, some cards back to 3, which would be Circo and Stalio. It makes a lot of sense. The deck wasn't doing enough without those cards, and even with those cards, it's not going to overwhelm the meta. The deck has always been able to utilize Access Code, which makes for an easy OTK, and right now it can also utilize Baguska very well, and it's basically the main goal if you can achieve it turn 1, because decks just hard lose to Baguska. And with Deco Talker Heat Soul, which is also a budget addition to this deck, even though it's a newly printed card, it was really cheap because of how massively it was printed, only as an ultra rare. So that's also very nice, you know, the deck got consistency with it, and the card itself is really strong, so it's a good addition. And before that, Salamangreat was a good deck even without it. Like I said, the Access Code OTK, easy utilization of different XYZ monsters, and you have the Parallel Exceed to go together with that. And some builds don't even use that. There are some ways that you can enhance the Salamangreat deck if you want with the Brave Engine, which is of course an expensive addition to the deck, but it's not necessary for it to function well and achieve what it must, which usually would be survive turn 1, rely on your board, your hand traps, because you have a lot of space in the deck, your back row, and then OTK on turn 3. It loses heart to Nibiru, but if you can learn to play around it, or maybe not play into it if you don't really need to, then even that is not an issue anymore. And then going through some of the deck lists, it's been doing very well. It got top 32 at the UK Nationals, and the deck list itself is very, very standard. And like I said, everything in it is cheap, except for maybe Access Code, which we mentioned, but even that got a reprint. So if you need to invest in any card in this deck, it's going to be Access Code, which is pretty much your main piece of the deck. And since everything else is so cheap, you're really getting a very, very good meta contender for extremely low price. So that's very nice. And a lot of builds tend to utilize Droplet, and overall decks like to use Droplet, Talents, Crossout Designator, a lot of those cards, which are not exactly budgets. So that would be like a different addition, a staple, I guess. If you have it on hand, of course you can use it, but it's not actually in archetypes. So even if some of those deck lists use those cards, that's not really an issue. Like, you can include it, and you really don't need to if you don't want to. So then we have like the Houston regional deck list, which is also very, very standard. It did well at the Trinidad and Tobago Nationals at top 16. You have the Parallel Exceed in this deck list. And it got first place at the Ecuador National, which is also a really, really good score. The deck is really strong, and it can catch people off guard, especially if it's piloted well. It may seem like it's very straightforward, especially with the Access Code OTK, but it's really not, because what I think makes the player good when they're piloting Salamangreat is how they can go around certain disruptions and predict certain disruptions that the opponent might have, like Veiler, like Nibiru, stuff that will really hinder you if you're trying to go for game. So yeah, overall, this deck having space for hand traps, also for back row, also for stuff like goes and match, like different techs that you can use depending on the format that you're playing it in, stuff like Baguska, Access Code, everything is just so well rounded, and I think this is like one of the top contenders right now, and people should really watch out for it. So the next one is going to be Sky Striker, and Sky Striker has been around for a very long time. I don't think I need to get more in depth than maybe just mentioning a couple cards that got more accessible with their reprints and are sort of vital for the Sky Striker strategy. Overall, the in-archetype stuff has been cheap for some time now, and you have the access code reprint. And since Hulk was also quite expensive before its reprint, right now with the reprint the price dropped significantly, so there's nothing to worry about over there. You can pick up Fiber if you want, even if it's going to get hit on the ban list, which is not 100% definitely. You're not going to be losing more than like $3 or like $4 with shipping if you pay for it, so that's not an issue. And then you have Mystic Mine. Like, it was a bit too expensive for a random super rare or the other rarity that it had, but right now with the gold reprint you can pick it up for fairly cheap, and it's, like I said, a very necessary addition. And yeah, overall we can just go over the deck list. You could play it going second with different techs, which we have seen a couple topping deck lists like that. You can play it just straight up with the Demise of the Land, with stuff like that, with Mystic Mine. And the deck list from German Nationals, for example, from top 8 had Mystic Mine and also Demise of the Land. Everything else in the deck list is fairly cheap. Solemn Judgment, it's not even like, it's one of those staples that's not as expensive, so you probably already own it. And then we have top 16 from the Trinidad and Tobago Nationals, which the deck list is almost completely the same. And I wanted to mention a couple, I guess, more expensive additions to the deck, which would be DPE, the Brave Engine, and also the Tyrian Engine. But none of these cards, none of these techs are necessary. Sky Striker, in my opinion, competes at its best when it's as pure as possible and just has a couple tech cards like Mystic Mine, like going second cards in the form of Raigeki, Lightning Storm, Evenly Matched, stuff like that, because sometimes you could clog your hands way too much with some engines that aren't that necessary. And right now, when there is no Anaconda, I personally probably wouldn't run the Fusion Destiny and the bricks, but that's very, like, that's personal preference. When it comes to the Tyrian cards, they feel a bit bricky as well for how expensive they are, being an addition to the deck. And as for the Brave Engine, I don't know, the entire Brave Engine sometimes feels a bit too bricky when you add it, not just a Sky Striker, but different strategies. So there's that when it comes to expensive cards. Also, Pot of Prosperity, like I mentioned with Flunder, it's so expensive and it's really not that necessary. And I get that Sky Striker sometimes struggles with consistency because they don't see Ray enough. But you know, I still don't think you should be investing in Prosperity just because of that. Like, the deck is doing fine without it. So, you know, there's that. And we have of course, the first place from YCS Hartford, which I went over this deck list in my YCS Hartford recap, so I will not go into it in depth, but it's quite basic. It's basic Sky Striker stuff. The winner was the first one to utilize the Demise of the Land, and then people started playing this, so they kind of became an originator of that, and this is a standard right now in Sky Strikers. So yeah, Sky Striker has kind of always been around, and it's always been a good contender because if you build Sky Striker properly to counter the exact meta you are in, I think you're fine, because you can build it just very well to be able to counter Despia, stuff like Shark Cannon, things like that, just deal with the Branded in red, and you have Mystic Mine, which just hard counters Despia by itself. And that's why I think Sky Striker is doing as great as it is right now. It's really really dangerous if piloted properly and if built properly. And with you being able to utilize Trap Trick together with D-Barrier, both of those cards are very cheap and they do a lot in today's format, so that's why I think this is also one of the top contenders. The next one is going to be Virtual World, and we're going to be going straight into the deck list because there is really not much to say about Virtual World, and it's cards that hasn't been said yet because it is fairly cheap, and also it's been sort of doing the exact same thing for the longest time. It's just not always seeing great results because it struggles with consistency a lot, but it's sometimes, you know, it does see results, and that's why we're having some of those deck lists right now. And what I wanted to mention specifically is none of those deck lists run the Brave Engine, and a lot of people, including myself, have been very hyped up for the Brave Engine in Virtual World, but it's just not working. It's way too bricky. And Virtual is one of those decks. First of all, it's a great deck to counter Sky Striker. So if you have a meta flooded with that deck, you can pretty much easily win with Virtual World. And besides that, if it's piloted properly, I think it's one of those decks that can really pose a threat, because whenever I face a Virtual World, for example, I just feel like you can never really know when to disrupt them. You can never really know how many names they have, or maybe they just bricked so hard they don't even know what's happening. And it's like the actual utility that extra deck provides is amazing. You have outs to almost every single scenario. You can utilize Zeus. And why I also think Virtual is really great right now is because D-Barrier is one of those cards that just so strong and so impactful in today's meta, but Virtual can really go into the Synchro route or the XYZ route almost the same, so it's not that much hindered by D-Barrier, which gets sided or even main decked a lot. And also, pretty much nobody is running Lancia at this point in time because there's really no deck to counter it with Lancia. So Virtual doesn't need to be afraid of that. Also, just looking at those deck lists right now, which I have on the screen, there's a lot of space for hand traps. You can utilize Gamma, Ash, DD Crow, for example, Impermanence, and still not hurt your own deck, because the engine is really, like, it's as big as it is. You still have a lot of space to get to 40 or 40, I don't know, 41, 42. Some people like to go over 40. And it's doing well, you know, Venezuela National, you have the South Dakota regional deck list. And Pot of Desires coming to 2 is also a good addition to the deck, which, as I keep mentioning, lacks consistency. And we have the first place from Peru National, of course. And the decklist is fairly simple. It plays the, I guess, combo version, you could say, with Crystal Wing, which most of those deck lists use. And it's just a nice board you can go into. Most of the time you will be able to set it up. You have Beatrice, which is also so strong right now, being able to send Snow or Token Collector in the Sword Soul matchup. And you also have a lot of decks that play the Scythe Lock, because you can send it with Beatrice and revive it with either Pyron or Baron. And I wanted to touch upon Baron as well, because Baron is very expensive, and it's also not that necessary, but it's a very welcome addition. Like, you can go into it and you can revive the Scythe, for example, which is really, really strong, but it's like still not one of those cards that you need to invest in for Virtual World to function properly. And the last thing I wanted to mention, since Emergency Teleport is at 3, it's an amazing addition to Virtual World, being able to bump the consistency a bit. So there's that as well. For the next deck, we're going to be discussing Tri-Brigade. Brigade has been around since forever. Like, since the reprints, which is in last year's tins, it was really, really cheap. But it sort of went in and out of the meta depending on how the other part of the meta evolved. Because sometimes decks are just way too strong for Brigade to even be able to hang with them. And it wasn't like the go-to choice for the longest time, because since the Lyrilusc part got hindered a bit, Tri-Brigade just wasn't able to do enough to be able to hang with the best of the decks. But right now they did get the Mercurier, and also they can utilize Albion the Shadow Dragon, which provides a bit of a boost to Tri-Brigade. If you pick it up, especially as a beginner, I think this deck is incredible because it does teach you like the basic plays of Tri-Brigade. But if you really play properly and if you make your decisions properly, you are going to become a better player piloting this deck, I think. And you also have the space to run a lot of tech cards and a lot of hand traps. It did receive Tinky back to 2 on the Forbidden Unlimited list. So it's one of those decks that, similarly to Salamangreat, this is a very, very, very good comparison, I think, because it survives OTKs. It has space for hand traps, it's cheap to pick up, and it has some of the most basic plays, but some of the most advanced ones if you look at it from another perspective, because you really need to think what you want to do. If you get disrupted with some cards, you need to think a couple steps ahead. And yeah, I think it helps people. Both of those decks can help people become better players. And if you go over the deck lists, you can see it has success, you know, from some regionals, from the Venezuela National, and the builds are also all of them pretty much the same. It utilizes Rescue Cat and the new stuff from the structure deck. Another expensive addition would be DPE, but it's not that necessary, and to me that feels bricky, but Like I said, stuff like that is personal preference. It also saw good success at the Las Vegas regional with first place, which is really, really nice. And yeah, the next deck we're going to be discussing is going to be Ignister, which has been doing really well ever since its YCS top. It's also one of those decks that has a basic 1-card combo, but it can OTK very, very, very easily. Has a lot of space for tech cards and hand traps, and also has a boss monster in the form of the Arrival Cybers, which most of the time cannot be dealt with. And it's so strong, because after you survive, like I say, with a lot of those decks, you can just OTK so easily. And it's one of those decks as well that sometimes I feel as though people don't really know how to play against it, or maybe when to disrupt it, because it has a lot of ways to get card advantage with the Kotakar Heat Soul, which is a good addition for this deck, not just Salamangreat. And also with the AI Contact, for example, when people draw into cards and they get into their hand traps and stuff like that, even though you maybe disrupt them at a certain point in the combo, if they disrupt you back because of the massive card advantage that they have been able to accumulate, they will be making a board or killing you or making the Arrival Cybers on turn 3 anyway. So it's one of those decks that's really hard to counter sometimes, and people are also not that prepared for it. It can also run Mystic Mime, which is like, it's a thing in itself. Like, that's almost a win condition right now, which is, you know, it's kind of silly, but it's how it is. And it saw success at the German National. It saw success at the Colombia National. And you can also play it pretty much however you want when it comes to how many cards you actually want to include in your deck. Because of the 1-card combos, if you calculate your ratios perfectly, you can play a lot of tech cards and go over 40 even. So, you know, you have space for like Mystic My main deck for stuff like that, and Pot of Desires is also really good to keep the consistency. You have Signet Mining for consistency as well. And then the only, I guess, a bit more expensive thing would be a Small World, which is not even necessary. So if you want to include it, you can. If you have access to it, you can. But everything else is very, very cheap, except for maybe access code. But very similarly to Salamangreat, it's almost a win condition, so you probably want to invest in it. And yeah, Ignister it's one of those decks that's very, very cheap to pick up. And if you have a lot of those hand traps, deck cards, things like that, I think you can build a very strong deck that can catch people off guard and grant you a lot of success. Okay, and the last one we're gonna get into is going to be Outlich. And first I want to stress that not everything is as cheap in Outlich as it probably should be, because some cards are just commons. And I'm talking about Skill Drain, and I'll have a screenshot on the screen for you. And if you look at TCG Player, I have sorted it from lowest to highest, and it's still so expensive for something that actually got a reprint not that long ago, but with the Hidden Arsenal, you know, dual terminal printing, and it's probably not being printed as massively. It's expensive, and it just shouldn't be that expensive, especially now that it's a 3 and you need to have 3 copies. But with all of that being said, I still want to include Outlich as a budget deck, because if you have some of those staples, which a lot of us have, if you invest in the actual core, you're not going to spend a lot of money. And not only is the core cheap, Outlich just does so well right now. Like, I think a very big difference can be seen between a good Outlich player and a bad Outlich player. So if you're a bad Outlich player, you know, you're just going to get annihilated. But if you're really good, I think you can achieve great results and great success, especially since Outlich builds vary so much. So depending on the amount of money you want to spend and the playstyle that you have and the actual event you're going to, you can choose to play something like a very pure Outlich build, which here at the UK Nationals in top 32, if you look at this deck list, it's just Traplich, and it has some of those a bit more expensive cards that I mentioned, which would be Skill Drain, but it doesn't even have IDP, and some of those floodgates are also like a couple dollars each. But most of those cards that goes in Rivalry, you probably have a playset off at home, and the Extravagance is also cheap right now because of the structure deck reprint, so there's that as well. And then you have the 12th place from Venezuela Nationals, and that's what I meant when I said you can play it in different ways. The branded version is cheap as well because everything that's cheap from the structure deck can be used in this deck. You have the branded fusion, you have the extra deck stuff. You know, there's no Guardian Chimera, there's no branded in red, there's no even no Masquerade. Like the expensive cards from that branded Despia deck are not included here. So you can invest into everything that's cheap and still have the cheap Eldritch core and just combine it to just make a very, very strong deck. And I also wanted to mention that it can be played with Brave, for example, and all of those versions, or including the Eldritch engine in the Synchro stuff, like that's expensive. So if you have those kinds of decks, of course you can play Eldritch in it because to invest into the actual core, it's very cheap, like I mentioned, but that's not the budget part of Eldritch. And the last thing I wanted to mention when it comes to Eldritch, I think it's going to be incredibly strong moving forward into the Splight and Tearlment format, so that's something to keep in mind as well. So yeah, for Eldritch to be able to run a lot of cards that are specific to the meta, something like the Barrier, a lot of those floodgates that are applicable in different situations, and the actual Eldritch engine, like all of this just makes for a deck that can really hang with the other best decks. And also the branded stuff I think is a very, very good addition. And with Extravagance being cheap and you being able to pick it up and up the consistency of your deck, I think that's very vital because trap decks tend to be bricky in a sense, because when you draw your opening hand, that's just what you're playing with. Like there's no extenders, there's no stuff like that. It's just, you know, those 5 cards which will more than likely be trap cards are going to direct how your game is going to turn out, because if you don't draw the perfect ones and if you don't play them perfectly, it's just how it is. And if you are able to draw with Extravagance and you actually can draw into multiple things to decide how you want to play your stuff, I think that's very, very important. So yeah, that's pretty much it when it comes to Eldritch. And with that being said, we're going to be ending this video. I went over the 6 decks, which I think are the best ones and the most budget all together. So yeah, if you have the option to pick any of them up, I think that would be a really, really good choice. So yeah, let me know what you think of this video. Let me know if I gave you any ideas, any advice, anything like that. I'm very grateful for that. And of course, if you liked it, like it, sub to the channel, check out all the social media, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.